everyone. Today I have with me author Rod Pyle. And Rod wrote this amazing book, and I'm trying not to get a glare because it's a glossy cover, and it's Amazing Stories of the Space Age. And I am so happy to talk to you, Rod. I mean, I don't feel worthy because when I read this book, and I read everything, okay? And when I got this, I was like, oh, I'd love to read this book. And I read it, and it was amazing. And then I asked you to come on, and you said yes. I don't know why, but you did. And I was like, oh my God, I get to talk to him about this amazing book. I mean, to say that it's amazing stories is like an understatement. These are stories that we don't learn about in school. Most of the time, because when I was in school, they were obviously classified, so I'm not going to learn about them. But I don't know that kids these days are learning about this anyway. I don't know that in the context. I wish I am a homeschooling mom. If you are a homeschooling mom out there and your child is interested in anything related to space, get this book because they're nice and they're short stories and they're very readable and your kid will love it. So, and like I said, I've been a homeschooling mom forever. My oldest son is 30. I have 6 children. I've homeschooled them all. And I always am looking for books. My son is interested. My 14-year-old is interested in astronomy, and that's why I got your book. And I am so happy I did. So,
well, I'm so glad you did too.
Yes.
And you know, there's a lot of surveys of different age groups that have done over the years about attitudes about the space program, and awareness is actually going up in the general population, which is good. But there's still a huge chunk of America. And actually, people in foreign countries understand it better than we do here. There's a huge chunk of America that doesn't know there's a space station going overhead every 90 minutes. A lot of people, I mean, the two main questions that came back in the general question box from one of the surveys was, A, I thought NASA had closed, and B, didn't the space station crash, which was, of course, Skylab in 1978, 79. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's and then on the other hand, there's people I used to teach quite a bit at college, and so this is a university level class, and the kids would say, "So when did we land people on Mars?" And I can't blame them because NASA's put out so many great looking videos about how we're going to get to Mars that if I wasn't paying attention, looks like we already did it, you know. So, yeah, awareness is a big thing. So glad you're doing this.
Yeah, and remember, I mean, I think I'm older than you, but I remember the day when we were in school and people would say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And almost every boy in the class would say, astronaut. You know, we were in the 70s, right? Okay, we're having all this success of landing on the moon and where are we going to go next and what are we going to do? And everybody wanted to be an astronaut. I don't think that's the case anymore. I don't think that they're learning about our space program or what is even going on. I do think that the movie The Martian that was released last year, I think that brought a lot of awareness back to like, oh, maybe we can go to Mars. Maybe there's something there. You know, it just seems like there was this lull, and maybe it was Challenger. I don't know. I wanted to get your opinion on that. I mean, I know that NASA took a 3-year break after Challenger, but do you think that also made people very scared of backing it, or I don't know. What do you think?
Well, there was Challenger, and then there was Columbia in 2003, which broke up on reentry. So those are our two big space disasters. And the problem with the shuttle, besides it didn't have nearly the redundancy Apollo did, so it was hard to recover from things. Apollo had a lot of backup systems the shuttle didn't have, just a different design. Mm-hmm. But the other problem was they were big crews. There were 6 or 7 people. So when something happened, you lost a big number. And so suddenly we caught up with and surpassed the Soviet Union in terms of lost space explorers. You know, I think it was a big ding in NASA's prestige. NASA, up until Challenger, had been, if I remember correctly, in terms of advertising jargon, it was the most recognized brand in the world. Mm. So the downside of both Challenger and Columbia was it was bad news. NASA made mistakes. NASA had management problems. NASA wasn't keeping their eye on the ball. These were some of the headlines you were seeing. And there was some of that. There was also a very complicated, grossly under-budgeted system. Nixon had cut the shuttle funds dramatically. So it worked, but it was kind of hanging on by its fingernails, you know. So NASA took this big hit, but at the same time, you know the old saying, any PR is good PR, and while it was an awful thing to see, it certainly raised people's awareness of, you know, space is difficult, space is hard, space is dangerous. we should try harder, I think was the net takeaway from that. Nowadays, if I go into a classroom of kids and say, what do you guys want to be when you grow up? An awful lot of them say rich, which is, I think, a conceit that's gained from watching the media. There's the Kardashians on TV, and there's a lot of rappers, and they're there with gold chains and women and cars and all that, and that's kind of become ingrained in young culture. But an awful lot of them are excited about space and science. And if you go somewhere like, I live pretty close to JPL, and I work up there on contract as a writer, and I talk to those people, most of whom are much younger. I'm 60, so there's an awful lot of people in their 20s and 30s walking around there with heat waves and brilliance radiating off their heads. They're a pretty incredible bunch. And they grew up watching NASA, mostly late shuttle and space station activities, and watching the kind of movies we're talking about, and watching Babylon 5 and the 100 iterations of Star Trek and everything else. And that's what got them, Star Wars, of course, that's what got them charged up and engaged. So I don't think it was a net negative in the long haul. I think it proved that it's very hard to do. Now what we're facing in the next couple of years, the book I'm finishing now is about the new space age. So I just interviewed the president of SpaceX yesterday, not Elon Musk, but Quinn Shotwell, his immediate, she's the COO and the president of the company. So she operates everything. And they are, I've never been in a rocket factory before. I've been to NASA plants. I've been to Virgin Galactic and a bunch of these places, but I've never been to a bona fide rocket. It looked like a car assembly plant. There's rocket fuselages stretching off as far as the eye can see in this enormous building, and this is just one of 3 or 4 of these places they have where they're building rockets. They're building them assembly line style. And that was incredibly exciting, but they're really pushing. They're very aggressive on their schedules. They're supposed to be flying people later this year because they got to start making these space station runs. That's their contract with NASA. So, at some point, probably not soon, and very possibly not SpaceX, but somebody's going to lose a crew, and we're going to have that little ding again, and we're just going to have to work past it because it's hard, it's dangerous, and now we've got this new age of the private sector stepping in and saying, we can do this for a lot less than you can, NASA. NASA ran an internal study and said, by gum, you're right, you can. It's from half to a fifth of what it costs us to do it, so go forth. So as they push and compete, there will be more calamities and more losses, but it's dangerous stuff.
Yeah. And I loved it. That's what I loved about The Martian, is because it actually made you believe that it's possible. Now, I know that it's a movie. It was a book. The guy did a lot of research, and he used a lot of people, to do his research for it. But it's like, it's really, I think everybody wants to think, especially with the way the Earth is going and with the weather changing and, all global, everybody's like, okay, can we go? Is that possible? And I read a lot of sci-fi books too. So I'm like, yes, I want to go there. I want to have, I want to be able to go to Mars, go to the moon, go, wherever. But I loved it. You had one of your stories about Venus. And so I was like, I wanted to talk to you there was a time that they thought that Venus was a possibility until they realized Venus isn't even close, right? That's not even,
Back, before 1962, 65, when we started sending robotic probes successfully out to those planets, all you could do was look through a telescope. So Venus is this, through a telescope, if you've ever seen it, it's a big white ball or a white crescent, depending on what phase you see it in, and it's covered with clouds that are opaque. So all you could do was take different readings from spectroscopes and so forth to try and get some idea of what was in the atmosphere. Couldn't see the surface. So we thought it was probably not the most friendly place by probably the 30s and 40s, but still nobody knew for sure. And if you read literature from back then, even quasi-scientific stuff, there are people saying, well, it might be a warm, swampy, cloudy version of Earth. And Mars, really, even when I was born in 1956. So I remember as a little kid reading stories about Mars that had guys in shirt sleeves or thin pressure suits and an oxygen mask but no helmet wandering around, Robinson Crusoe on Mars, that kind of thing. And, we thought there might be, again, telescopic image wavering because it's looking through the atmosphere, coming in out of focus. We didn't know if there were plants there. We're pretty sure there weren't canals and intelligent Martians by 1965 when Mariner 4 first flew past, but didn't really know. And then came that moment where those 22 pictures came back in 1965 from Mariner 4, and it looked a lot like the moon. They were grainy and low resolution, but here was this dry, parched, cratered, nasty-looking surface, and the news just got worse from there until we began to realize in the early 70s and later that there had been a lot of water there at one point. So clearly this place had been very wet. There were all these water-eroded features and river deltas and so forth. And you could see that Mars had at one point been inundated with water. And now, of course, with the new rovers, we're finding that this is the case, and there was standing water for long periods of time. Venus, on the other hand, having finally gotten to the surface of the Soviet Union when they landed there, robots only, of course, is really hot. It's about 900 degrees Fahrenheit, I think, killing atmospheric pressure, and acidic rain. So the surface is kind of a non-starter. However, there are people, I don't think I was able to put this in the book because I had enough material by the time I was done for 2. So I had to cut it in half, and I'm hoping to do another one. But there's been talk about building floating cloud stations in the Venusian atmosphere, in the upper atmosphere, where it is temperate and where you could be you'd still be in a pressure vessel, obviously, and have artificial atmosphere. But it's a place where you can actually hang around and do good scientific work without being on the surface. So there's hope for Venus yet. But what was in the book that I think was so exciting was this idea that we were finishing Apollo. The rocket assembly lines are ramping down and starting about 1966 because they had finished the Saturn V's, and there was this kind of uncertain outcome. What was going to happen next? What we knew is we had this many moon flights, and that would probably be it for the moon. They had hoped to build more. They had hoped to build a station on the moon. They had hoped to do more exploration. But they also evolved these plans in the Apollo Applications Office where they were trying to rationalize, how can we keep this workforce going? How can we keep building these wonderful machines we've designed from nothing starting in 1961? And one of the missions, as you saw, was this either fly by Venus, fly by Mars, or fly by both in a very long extended mission, which would have meant months to the destination, maybe 12 hours looping the far side and then coming home. So, the rewards are kind of small. And that idea has been resuscitated a number of times, even though it's a short period of time. Even as recently as, I think, September 2016, I was at a conference, and the head of human spaceflight for NASA was there. And so I pulled him aside for an interview, sort of ambushed him, and said, "Could I talk to you?" But he gave me almost an hour, and he said the word flyby. And I said, "You guys are still studying flybys for Mars?" Because I knew private people had talked about that, but I didn't think NASA was still looking at it. And he said, "Yeah, if the budget constraints are such that we feel we need to do that first, then that's what we'll do. We'll send a crew out there, sling past the far side, and come home." So I think that's there's a romance to that.
There is. There is. I think that everybody, you don't know anybody that doesn't think that space exploration isn't that's why we have so many sci-fi writers. That's why there's so many movies. It is romantic. It's amazing to think, is it possible? Can we go there? And I had this question, and I'm not even sure if you answered it in the book, because I think I had it later on. And I was, when you had said something about the moon being very, they discovered that the moon really wasn't what they thought it was going to be. And I was thinking, well, what is wrong with the moon? I don't think I know. What did they find that was wrong? Because I don't know. You explain it. I have no idea.
Well, before we landed Surveyor was an unmanned probe that landed just a few years before the first Apollo landing. So I think it was 65 or 66 was the first Surveyor landing. At that point, we really didn't know what to expect. There was a lot of theorizing, which continued up until the Apollo landings, I might add, that there was so much dust just from years of micrometeorites hitting the moon's surface that the LEM might touch down and just vanish in 20 feet of dust, and the guys would be gone forever. There are other theories about, they'd step outside and the electrostatic attraction would cover them in moon dust and they wouldn't be able to see or move. And there's all this stuff. That was the space age. They were even concerned before they launched Alan Shepard into a suborbital flight in 1961. They were concerned that and you see these films, you hear Richard Basehart, the old Shakespearean actor narrating, will man expire in space? They were afraid he wouldn't be able to swallow it. He'd choke to death and his heart would stop and they'd have separation anxiety and all this stuff. None of that happened. Turns out it's tough on the human body over the long term, but for short flights, a matter of a week or two, space is fine. The moon turned out to be more or less what we expected by the time we got there because it had been reconnoitered pretty well. The composition of the rocks were a little unexpected. There was a lot of glass in them. There's a lot of aluminum. There's a lot of other things that you can actually use once you're there in force. So that way, the moon turned out to be pretty good. The most exciting discovery over the last couple of decades has been that there's water there. There's actually water in the soil, and there's water, especially concentrated, we think, up in the poles. They've been able to get a spectral reading back that indicates it looks like there's big masses of water ice up there. So where you've got water, you can get breathable oxygen by cracking the water. You can get rocket fuel. You have drinkable water. You have all these advantages because it's really expensive to haul that stuff along. Launching a gallon of water costs tens of thousands of dollars. So if you can find it up there, bingo, right? So the moon turned out to be okay. The dust is a little bad for you. They think breathing it is probably not great for your lungs. You have the same problem on Mars. The soil is actually kind of toxic up there. But the bigger problem with all this that was worse than expected from the 60s moving outward was discovering how much radiation is out there. When you read some of the early chapters of the book, like von Braun's plan for his massive Mars expedition in the early 50s, it's basically making a light submarine, except the pressure is moving the opposite direction against the hull. It's pushing outward instead of inward, and sending a fleet of them in space off to Mars, and they were going to land with gliders and all this kind of thing. And it was really exciting. The problem is, although he addressed radiation a little bit, it's worse than we thought. So when you're out there, the effects in the body range from just raising your overall chances of getting cancer to possibly dementia, cardiovascular issues. There's a whole long list of evils of space radiation. So that's really been the biggest deal breaker so far in terms of long term. So if we go to the moon and send humans there to stay, if we go to Mars and send humans there to stay, for at least the first decade or two, they're probably going to be living in cans underground with a bunch of soil over the top to try and mitigate this radiation. So, I'm with you. I love the romance of the idea of this. I would go in a heartbeat if I thought I could actually be okay in the capsule with the door closed. I'm a little claustrophobic. But the idea of being there, the idea of expeditions there, great. Living there would be tough. One thing about The Martian, by the way, I love that movie. And it's one of the few of its type that showed, recently anyway, that made space look fun again. Even though he was in a calamitous situation, he made the best of it. And he had a good sense of humor. And you got to love the actor. It was great. Matt Damon's fun, If you look at the National Geographic special they did a six-episode miniseries about Mars. And it was overall pretty miserable and depressing, and everything went wrong, and people were dying right and left. And you thought, well, this looks like a real drag, Ron Howard. Why would you make your show look like that? But that's drama. Gravity, space stations smashing into the shuttle, and people dying right and left again, and all that. So we had this spate of towering inferno-style space disaster films that kind of put a bit of a negative spin on it. So one of the things I loved about The Martian, besides the happy ending, is just that he was having a pretty good time. But there were a few things in there, and they brought NASA in. They brought in the head of Solar System Exploration, I think, as their consultant. There are a few things they didn't address, like the soil's poisonous.
So the food he was growing in the...
bringing it in to grow potatoes, or even just tracking it with your suit between the chemistry of the soil. And they think, although we got to get a sample to see, and they're working on that, but they think it's going to be sharp enough that it would be almost like breathing asbestos. So you're really going to have to work hard, even if you're living on Mars, to stay separate from Mars in a sense. It's a place to touch down, but you'll basically be living in a larger version of your spacecraft, whether you're in an outpost or your pressure suit. You're kind of moving from one artificial environment to another just so you can explore this planet. So there are limits, but...
whereas that movie made it seem more like, even though he had the spacesuit on, that the ground was ground, and that
Yeah.
you know that it was, and he was driving a vehicle. I mean, it was like
Yeah.
roads, you know. But
It's like Death Valley with very little air, right?
yeah, yeah. But I was watching Neil deGrasse Tyson has a really cool. He has some YouTube channels that are really cool,
Yeah.
and I thought that one of the things he brought up was about the fact that what I don't think that we hear enough about is that space travel is dangerous because of all the things floating around in space, all the meteoroids, and he was showing the size. Like there would be a piece this big, but if it hits, it explodes because of the force.
Right.
You know, so if there's an astronaut on the other side, it could go right through. It would go right through. Like they really need to, you know, and I don't know what year he made this. I should have looked. But they're working on that material being that if it's getting pelted or they go through a storm, a meteorite storm or something, that, you know, we still haven't gotten the right material, and maybe we have by now, but when he made this video, and I was like, oh, I never really thought about that. It's risky all around.
It is, but actually, you know, radiation and weightlessness are much bigger enemies to the human body. There's a lot less drifting around out there than we thought. If you go to the asteroid belt, that's a bad place. Maybe there's these areas called the Lagrange points where you can put spacecraft or outposts in stable orbits between the Earth and the Moon or on the far side of the Moon, and they just stay there. And space junk may collect there, but overall, from the 60s on out, they put micrometeoroid detectors on these unmanned spacecraft. You see, you know, it's emptier than we thought, at least in terms of rocks and chunks of ice. Okay. But you're right. I mean, even with the shuttle, which is in low Earth orbit, it was only up there a couple hundred miles. They found, and most of what you run into is stuff that we put there.
Oh.
Because if something comes from outer space, it usually ends up entering and becomes a shooting star, right? But we put up thousands of satellites, rocket boosters that exploded. Mm-hmm. Things age up there. The shuttle front window at one point was hit by a fleck of paint about the size of a dime. Paint. This is just paint. This isn't metal. This isn't a rock. This isn't a chunk of ice. It was just paint, and it cracked the window. It put a big divot in the window.
Yeah, I think I saw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, fortunately, they were 4 layers thick because they were prepared for this. From then on, they turned the shuttles around and had them orbit engines first, because once it's up there, you don't need those main engines to come home. And at least that way, if it got hit by something, it would have to drive through all that metal to get to anything soft, like people. So it is risky, but it does seem, I did, 40 interviews for this new space age book I was just talking about. Mm-hmm. And that came up a lot, especially with this flight surgeon at Johnson that I interviewed, really nice guy, in Bill Tarver. And he said, you know, the big enemy really is radiation and weightlessness. We can overcome those things. The rest of it, it's just a matter of process.
Yeah, and Neil deGrasse Tyson was in this room because they're trying to figure out how to pressurize or how to give gravity. Because I guess there was this Russian guy. I'm just talking to you about another YouTube video, but anyway, whatever. There's this Russian guy that was up there for a really long time, and he lost a lot of bone density, muscle, you know. So what they're trying to do is like add gravity or a fake kind of gravity to some of the rooms or something, so that they can at least go to a room and experience some type of gravity. And he ended up getting sick. So.
Well, they've been talking about, the problem is you can't create less than one full Earth gravity on Earth. The only way they can do that is by putting you in an airplane, which is called the KC-135, or more colloquially, the vomit comet, because a lot of people lose their food. And they fly these parabolas. So they fly up, and you feel 2 or 3 times normal gravity. And then when they go over the top and then start flying down, you float away from the airplane, right? Because the airplane's falling, and you're staying in one place. So, they're able to simulate zero gravity that way for, 90 seconds, 40 seconds, something like that. Not very long. Just long enough to shoot scenes for Apollo 13, which is how they did a lot of those.
Right.
But otherwise, on Earth, you're stuck with 1G. You can increase gravity with a centrifuge.
Right, that's what it did, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, when you're up in space, what they've been talking about really since the 40s, and it's in a couple of the book chapters, is creating artificial gravity up there. Right. By having either a spinning wheel like we had in 2001: A Space Odyssey, or a couple of modules out on arms that extend the spacecraft and spin. They think they don't need to do a full gravity because that's pretty aggressive, but even if they could do 30% of Earth's normal,
right.
25%. That at least cuts down on the worst effects. Pardon?
I think you have a picture of that circular thing, don't you?
Yeah, I think I got a picture of a couple of the plans they did. They've never really tried it. They started during the Gemini program. They started an experiment with a tether that would extend from the Gemini capsule with a mass at the other end and get them rotating around a common center.
Right.
And kind of worked, but they had to call it quits early because they were having problems. But the problem, the overall problem with this is it's mechanically complicated. Oh, the Werner von Braun's wheel, the inflatable space station, yeah. But, that would work. It's just expensive and hard to put up there, and there's a lot of engineering to be done. So really, as much as that seems like the obvious mechanical solution, if you talk to the NASA people right now, we've been up at the space station since the 90s, so we got a lot of experience floating around because that's all zero-G. Their attitude is, you know what? We've had people up there for over a year now. The Russians have had people up there for longer than that. Mm-hmm. And there are ways to mitigate this without having to build all these very expensive mechanical contraptions. So if astronauts do 2 hours of exercise a day, so on treadmills and bikes with bungee cords holding them down and all that, that keeps them from losing so much muscle mass. It also keeps their bodies slightly better oriented, so they're losing less as they're staying up there. And there's all kinds of other interventions they're looking at. One of the problems that they hadn't seen until the last few years was the eyes change shape. Because apparently the pressure in the brain lowers because the body fluid is redistributed because gravity's not tugging down. So the eyes kind of flatten out, and they don't know if it's a permanent or temporary thing. So that's a problem. There's other concerns about neurological issues and so forth. So there's a ton of stuff to worry about. But I think they'll probably figure out a way to do it without having to build rotating structures. But that's ultimately the best solution.
You know what I think about when I hear about all these things that we have to do to survive outside of our atmosphere is like, isn't it amazing how we are built for this atmosphere?
Well, we grew up here, right?
I know, and it amazes me that we are perfect for what we have,
right.
and going anywhere else we have to adjust to that.
Yeah.
And
the more complex the organism is, the more adjusting it has to do. So the Russians sent one of their Soyuz capsules back in the 60s on a loop around the moon. They were still racing us to the moon at that point. So they sent it out there with no people, but it had a couple of turtles, some microbes, some mealworms, a couple of fruit flies, some other things, because they wanted to see not just could these organisms survive that period of weightlessness in that environment, but they also wanted to see how increasingly complex organisms would survive or be altered. And they all came back fine because it was only a matter of a few days out, a few days back. Mm-hmm. But you get complicated like people, and we evolved from primates and whatever came before that on Earth. So, of course, we're ideally adapted to this environment. So you take us out to space, which hates human beings. We're just big bags of water and muscle. And there's a vacuum, and the temperature extremes are a couple hundred degrees above on one side and a couple hundred degrees below Fahrenheit on the other. Right. And there's all kinds of things out there, including radiation, that want to put you in an early grave. If you don't even get to do that, if you're out there, you're just floating around, right?
Right.
And so it's tough. There's also other people, and this is more theoretical, but if you talk to people who are on the more visionary side of things, both inside and out of NASA, they will, more off the record, talk about this idea of transhumanism, which is how do you adapt? Let's stop trying to adapt space to people. Let's adapt people to space. Yeah. So is it telepresence, where you're sitting with a headset and the robot is an extension of your senses? That's kind of the most basic version. Or do we take human consciousness and put it in some kind of AI setup or a brain in a glass jar, who knows, and stick it on a robot, because machines do fine out there. It's our bodies that are constantly letting us down. So that's kind of an area of growing interest, but it's out there. Pardon?
That's a great sci-fi book right there.
Well, it is, and I could pick a new face. I wouldn't mind that. I've got this, what they call a face for radio, and if I was going to go out there, I'd be George Clooney, man. So give me the Clooney model. I'll take that in a heartbeat.
Well, you've written like 20, I think I've read 20 some books, okay?
10. Only 10.
Oh, you're right, 10. Okay. I didn't.
Lots of articles, but only 10 books.
Okay, 10 books. So and you said you had to cut a lot from this. And, first of all, look at this cover. I love this cover. They did such a good job with it. I'm a cover
Thank
person,
you.
so
I take
I
credit
really,
for that.
yeah.
I got a couple of different cover prototypes from the publisher, and I said, no. You have to understand, this is the space age. So I finally put one together myself and sent it in, and after a lot of pushing and pulling, they relented and said, okay, we'll fix up your cover and use it. So
you won.
Yay.
Yeah. No, yeah. I love the cover. But okay, so you're just going to keep, when I was reading this, besides the research that you did for this, and a lot of it was declassified and everything, but you know so much about this stuff. Like, I was just amazed at how detailed, and I was like, wow, this is just amazing. You say amazing stories. I was just amazed at the detail of these stories, and it reads like a novel. Your writing of it was so awesome that even somebody like me, who knows very, very little, movies, books, like I said, I feel unworthy to interview somebody that with your knowledge, but I did read it, and I want everybody to know, like, it's readable. It's stories that everybody can relate to, and that's why I would use it for school for anybody who was interested in this. It's not above my pay grade is interviewing you, not reading the book. Okay.
No. I really appreciate that, and it's interesting. As a small addendum to that, I got an email from a professor at I think it's Embry-Riddle University. They're an aerospace university.
Yes.
Who was asking me when it was going to come out a few months ago, because he wanted to use it in a class. He teaches engineering, aeronautical engineering. He said, I want to use it on a class of thinking outside the box. And I thought, well, it never struck me that would be I wrote another book called Innovation the NASA Way that was supposed to be for that. But he said, no, I want to use this one because these stories are wild and it shows these guys weren't limiting themselves by budget constraints and all that. And I thought, well, that's very cool. The great thing now is, when I started writing books, or at least when I was writing nonfiction scripts, I used to do TV documentaries. Mm-hmm. You had to go to the library and pull out the file cards, remember, in the 3-foot drawer, and fill through them, and then look the book up and go, oh, it's checked out, it's been overdue for 6 years, all this kind of thing. Now I just get online like everybody else. So the cool thing is this stuff is available. Mm-hmm. A lot of it's been declassified. I think a number of those stories only declassified about 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. So there's more and more out there all the time. The hard part isn't finding the story anymore. The hard part is making sure that it's correct. Mm. So I had a number of people, but a gentleman named David Clow is a space writer, a gentleman named Francis French, who works at the San Diego Air Space Museum, their education department. He's also a space writer. And a woman named Susan Holden Martin, who used to be the executive director of the Mars Society and is very involved in this stuff. And I asked all three of them to please go through the book and just double check things because, you go back to sources from the time. You go back to original studies, papers written up from the Apollo era, and you can find 3 different versions of anything if you look long enough. And at a certain point, you just want to say, okay, I'll that one. I don't want to know anymore. But you got to keep checking because you want to make sure it's correct. And sometimes, even if you can interview the people that were there at the time, like an astronaut, they're in their 80s. Memories faded a bit. So you get 2 or 3 different answers there. So that's the hard part, is just making sure everything's right.
Yeah, and what I loved about it also is because I'm a history nut. Okay, I read history books all the time, interview a lot of historians, and I would put this in that category also because there's so much history that was involved in NASA and before NASA and the people that, you go back to the beginning of when people were first just starting to think about, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And World War II was also huge in trying to figure some of this stuff out when they were bombing each other. So, like when they were using their knowledge for destruction instead of for space exploration. But it takes us back to the beginning. And that's what I loved about it because I didn't learn that in school. I didn't learn about the beginning of from what I knew, it was like the 60s. I was like, okay, we decided, Kennedy was like, we're going to the moon. All right, we're going to the moon, like, and I think a lot of people think that way too. I think a lot of people think that way.
Well, it's not part of NASA's big story, at least for the easily understood public version. They keep it pretty simple. because they know people have short attention spans when it comes to reading this stuff, at least on the web. But you're right. I mean, World War II is really when we started looking at high-performance aircraft, pressurized aircraft. We're flying so high now we have to breathe pressurized air. And the Germans did some of that in World War I, but largely World War II. Mm-hmm. And coming out of World War II with an incredible burst of technological development towards unfortunate ends, sadly.
Right.
You move into the 50s, you start seeing the X-planes and breaking the sound barrier and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And that's really what sort of propelled us into being able to even think about doing the space age. People have been thinking about trying those things since the turn of the century. In some cases earlier, there were thinkers, famously Russian Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was the father of rocketry. And there are lots of ideas, but in terms of pounding those into something that's made out of metal and hurling it at the moon, that was an exponentially tougher problem, right?
Right.
So even up through 1961, when Kennedy made that announcement, NASA was still scratching its head, as were the Russians, about does one big rocket go to the moon and land a piece of it and come home, or do we rendezvous in Earth orbit? Do we rendezvous in lunar orbit? How are we going to do this? And it was really an awful lot of incredible innovation, or some people have popped me on that and said, no, it wasn't innovation, it was development. I'd argue it was both. To come up with these machines that could do that. And in every case, you look at Apollo, for instance, it was just enough. Right. The rocket's just big enough to get us all the way out to the moon. The lunar module's just good enough to get us down to the surface and back safely. That metal was so thin, it was like the thickness of a Coke can. You could punch through it with a pencil.
Right.
It was very delicate. And then the capsule is just big enough to bring 3 guys home safely at 25,000 miles an hour. So that's space exploration right within the bleeding edge limits. Then you look at something like, what is it? I think it's Chapter 4, Project Orion. Mm-hmm. That's the atomic spaceship.
Right.
When I say atomic, I don't mean atomic reactor engine, which is one way to do it. I mean it was a big 50 caliber bullet-shaped, tens of thousands of tons spaceship, looked like a battleship, that would drop nuclear bombs out the back, and the bombs exploding propelled it. Crazy design. Engineers to this day say it's doable. It's just a question of building it. Well, in that case, now you're really onto something, because you can have Barca loungers and pets and 70 people in it and food and water and everything you need for years of exploration. So that kind of thinking is really out of the box, and that's fun.
Right. I was thinking if I could find a picture, but yeah. So what are you going to do next? Like, are you already into the next book?
I'm just finishing this week a manuscript for a book that's tentatively titled Space 2.0, and it's all about the new NASA and SpaceX and Blue Origin and Maiden Space and all these companies that are breaking through the old limits of what we thought we could do with government aerospace, government space exploration. So that's been great, because I got access to a lot of people that normally I wouldn't rub shoulders with, like the people at SpaceX. Uh-huh. And so that'll be going in probably Friday. I'm writing a short book for Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It's sort of internal use. It'll go public, but it's primarily intended to go to NASA headquarters, talking about their technological breakthroughs in the last couple of years. And then I've got a couple planned, fingers crossed, have to talk to publishers, for the Apollo 11 anniversary coming up, because in late 2018 is the 50th anniversary of the first orbital flight, and mid-2019 is the 50th anniversary of the first lunar landing, and those are big. So I definitely want to be in that crowd saying, hey, look, I got another book, and it's got a lot of cool stuff in it. I wrote a book in 2009 called Missions to the Moon. Mm-hmm. It's one of these pull out of the slip cover kind of deluxe presentation things. And every couple of pages, you'd have an envelope with a document from the era in it. So it'd have the Apollo lunar landing map, or designs for the control panel of the LEM, or the letter that the FBI sent to NASA, with all these redactions in it about how we're going to deal with the Werner von Braun image problem and this kind of thing. So I'm hoping to do something like that for Apollo 11, but we'll see.
Oh, that's amazing.
It's a fickle marketplace.
Well, that's great. I mean, I'll keep reading your books. So you keep publishing them and writing them. I'll keep reading them. And like I said, here it is, everybody. And you can only... Did this come in hardback?
No, it's softback and Kindle.
Okay. Yeah, because I try to get hardback if I can. So, and I get a stock of books every single day. So I order when I get it in a softback. I'm assuming that it's not hardback. I'm assuming I couldn't get it in hardback. But, it's got great pictures in it.
And that way.
Yeah, and it's I highly recommend this, and I'm so happy I got to speak with you, Rod. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me, and just get in touch with me. You can come on anytime you want. Anytime you got a book, we can talk.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, you have a great day. Thank you.